Don't leave a note for a vampire king unless you're ready for him to remember you forever. That was the thought Emily Carter would later wish she had listened to. But at 3:17 a.m., she was simply too tired to think about consequences. The coffee shop had been empty for nearly an hour, its last customer long gone, and the rain outside turning the streets of downtown Boston into ribbons of reflected light. Emily stood behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. She had worked the closing shift 6 nights a week for almost a year, and she had learned that the strangest part of working after midnight was not the darkness outside. It was the feeling that someone was always watching. She had never seen anyone. She had never heard footsteps. Yet every few nights, when she glanced toward the front window, she could swear a tall figure stood across the street beneath the old stone archway. Tonight, she finally decided she was imagining things. She pulled a small receipt from beneath the register and wrote a few words on the back. It was not meant for anyone important. It was barely even a message. Some people spend centuries waiting for the right person. Maybe you should stop waiting. Emily stared at the sentence, almost embarrassed by how personal it sounded. She folded the receipt once, then slipped it beside the coffee machine. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would throw it away. She turned off the lights, grabbed her coat, and left through the back door. She never noticed the black sedan parked half a block away. She never saw the man sitting inside it. Adrian Blackwood had watched the coffee shop for 3 nights without understanding why. He had lived for more than 300 years, and almost nothing surprised him anymore. Cities changed. Buildings disappeared. Names were forgotten. People he once knew became portraits in museums and dates in history books. But tonight, something had changed. The instant Emily left, Adrian stepped into the empty shop. He moved quietly through the darkness, his pale face illuminated by the faint blue glow of the street outside. He stopped beside the coffee machine. The little receipt waited exactly where she had left it. He picked it up and read the words once. Then again. His expression did not change, but something deep inside him did. No human had spoken to him that way in centuries. No one had dared to suggest that the Vampire King was waiting for anything. Adrian turned the paper over, expecting to find a name. There was none. Only a tiny coffee stain near the bottom and a handwritten sentence that seemed impossibly ordinary. Yet he could not put it down. He looked toward the door Emily had used moments earlier. For the first time in centuries, the king who had stopped believing in coincidence found himself wondering about one ordinary woman who had no idea he existed. And before sunrise, Adrian Blackwood would make a decision that would change both their lives. He would come back tomorrow. Ciao ban. Waving hand rat vui duak gap li ban. Hom ne minko the teep tuc ho tro ban voi fan kitch ban. Outline cinematic. Hope prompt whisk nu and hung lon truok. Smiling face with smiling eyes. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm. Inside the old mansion, the Vampire King stood beside the tall window, watching pale moonlight settle over the quiet grounds. He had not moved for several minutes. Behind him, the young woman remained near the fireplace, still trying to understand everything she had learned that evening. She had entered this strange world expecting answers, but every answer seemed to reveal another question. You said the truth would change everything, she finally said, her voice calm but uncertain. The Vampire King turned toward her. For the first time, his expression did not carry the distant confidence she had noticed when they first met. There was something more human in his eyes, something almost like regret. It already has, he replied. He walked toward an old wooden table and carefully opened a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with handwritten notes and unfamiliar symbols. He placed it in front of her and pointed to a passage near the center. She leaned closer. The words described a promise made generations earlier, a promise connected to the mansion, the surrounding town, and the mysterious bond that had brought them together. She looked up slowly. This was written before I was born. Long before, he answered. Then why does it mention me? The question lingered between them. The Vampire King did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the staircase, where the darkness seemed unusually still. He explained that the journal was not a prediction in the ordinary sense. It was a record of choices, written by people who believed that certain moments would eventually return. One of those moments, he said, had begun the night she arrived. The young woman felt a quiet chill, not from fear, but from realizing that her arrival might have been part of a much larger story. She turned another page and discovered a faded drawing of the mansion. Beneath it was a single sentence describing a person who would enter when the old clock stopped at midnight. Her eyes moved toward the grandfather clock in the corner. It had stopped. The hands rested precisely at 12. She looked at the Vampire King. He gave a slow nod. That is why I asked you to stay until morning. Outside, the clouds began to separate, revealing a brighter moon. Somewhere in the mansion, a door quietly opened. Neither of them moved. The young woman closed the journal and stood. Then we should find out what is waiting for us. For the first time that night, the Vampire King smiled. Not with confidence, but with quiet acceptance. Together, they stepped toward the hallway, knowing that whatever came next would finally reveal why their paths had crossed. The hallway seemed longer than it had only moments before. The young woman followed the Vampire King beneath the dim golden lamps, holding the leather-bound journal close to her chest. Neither spoke. The quiet sound of their footsteps seemed to echo through the mansion as though the old house itself were listening. At the end of the corridor stood a narrow door she had never noticed before. It was made of dark wood and marked with the same symbol she had seen in the journal. The Vampire King stopped several feet away. This room has remained closed for generations, he said. No one has opened it since the night the promise was written. The young woman studied the symbol. Something about it felt strangely familiar, although she could not explain why. She reached toward the door, then hesitated. What happens if I open it? We discover whether the past was waiting for you, or whether we have misunderstood it. His answer was calm, but his eyes revealed uncertainty. She placed her hand against the old handle and gently turned it. The door opened without resistance. Beyond it was a small library covered in dust, with shelves filled from floor to ceiling. Moonlight entered through a tall window and illuminated a single desk in the center of the room. On the desk rested a sealed envelope. Her name was written across it. She stared at the envelope in disbelief. How could someone have known I would come here? The Vampire King stepped closer, but he did not touch it. That is the question we must answer. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in elegant handwriting. The message explained that the mansion had been protected for generations by a promise between two families, one connected to the human world and one connected to the hidden world. The promise had never been about power. It had been about protecting a secret that could only remain safe if both sides chose trust over fear. As she continued reading, she discovered a final passage that changed the meaning of everything she had learned. The person who was meant to fulfill the promise was not chosen because of family blood or ancient tradition. The choice belonged to the person who could see the truth without allowing fear to control it. She lowered the letter slowly. That sounds like a choice anyone could make. Exactly, the Vampire King said. Which means the decision is yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Earlier, she had believed that he possessed all the answers. Now she understood that he had been searching for them too. A soft sound came from somewhere outside the library. The grandfather clock had started moving again. Its hands were no longer fixed at midnight. The young woman folded the letter and placed it inside the journal. Then I will not run from the truth. The Vampire King nodded. Together, they returned to the hallway, but neither noticed the small candle on the library desk beginning to glow beside a second unopened letter. The hallway was quiet again, but the young woman could not stop thinking about the second letter waiting inside the library. She had only taken a few steps when she stopped and looked back. The Vampire King noticed immediately. You felt it too, he said. She nodded. There is something else in that room. They returned to the library, and the candle on the desk was still glowing beside the unopened envelope. Its flame was steady despite the cool air drifting through the window. The young woman approached the desk and looked at the writing on the envelope. Unlike the first letter, this one carried no name. Instead, there was a simple symbol that matched the mark on the hidden door. The Vampire King remained several feet away. You should open it, he said. She carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, along with a small brass key. The message was shorter than the first letter, but its meaning was far more personal. It explained that the mansion had not simply been waiting for someone to discover its secret. It had been waiting for someone willing to understand why the secret had been protected for so long. The letter described a chamber beneath the oldest part of the house, a place where records had been preserved for generations. According to the message, The chamber contained the original account of the promise and the reason the two families had once agreed to protect one another. The young woman looked at the brass key in her palm. Where does this go? The Vampire King studied it carefully. His expression changed when he recognized its shape. There is only one place it could belong. He led her toward the eastern wing of the mansion, where the walls were lined with portraits covered by dark fabric. They stopped before the oldest portrait, showing a woman standing beside a man beneath the same moonlit sky that surrounded the mansion that night. The Vampire King gently moved the fabric aside and revealed a small keyhole hidden within the frame. The young woman inserted the key. A quiet click echoed through the room. The portrait shifted slightly, revealing a narrow passage behind it. She looked at the Vampire King. You knew this was here? I knew there was a forgotten passage. I did not know the key still existed. Together, they entered the passage. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of old paper. After several minutes, they reached a circular room filled with wooden shelves. Hundreds of journals rested there, each marked with a year. In the center stood a stone table holding one final book. Unlike the others, it looked almost new. The young woman opened it and found the first page completely blank. Then, before their eyes, words slowly appeared across the paper. They described everything that had happened since her arrival at the mansion, including the moment she had opened the first letter. She stepped back in astonishment. The Vampire King stared at the pages in silence. Then another sentence appeared, revealing that the story had not been written in the past. It was being written now. The young woman stared at the words appearing across the ancient book, unable to decide whether she was witnessing something impossible or simply discovering a truth the mansion had kept hidden for generations. The Vampire King stood beside her, equally silent. A new sentence slowly formed beneath the previous one. The next choice belongs to both of you. She looked at him. Both of us. He nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that is what the old promise was always trying to tell us. The pages continued to change. They described the history of the two families, but not as a story of rivalry or fear. Instead, they revealed two families who had once lived separately, each protecting a different part of the same secret. Over time, misunderstandings had created distance between them. The promise had been created to prevent that distance from becoming permanent. The young woman turned another page and discovered a map of the mansion. A small mark appeared beneath the oldest section of the house, directly below the room where they stood. There is another chamber, she said. The Vampire King studied the map. Not another chamber, the original room. They followed the markings to a narrow staircase hidden behind the shelves. The steps descended only a few feet before ending at a circular stone doorway. There was no handle, no lock, and no visible mechanism. The young woman placed her hand against the center of the door. Nothing happened. The Vampire King placed his hand beside hers. For several seconds, the room remained completely still. Then a soft warmth spread through the stone, and the doorway slowly opened. Beyond it was a small chamber illuminated by natural moonlight entering through a narrow opening above. In the center stood a wooden box. The young woman approached it carefully. Inside were several old photographs, handwritten letters, and a silver pendant resting on a folded piece of cloth. She picked up the pendant and noticed the same symbol engraved on its surface. The Vampire King recognized it immediately. That belonged to the first keeper of the promise. She looked at him. And now, he paused before answering. Perhaps it belongs to the person who decides what happens next. She held the pendant for a moment, then placed it back inside the box. I do not think we should decide anything until we know the whole truth. The Vampire King smiled quietly. Then we agree. Behind them, the ancient book began turning its own pages. When they returned to the table, a new message had appeared. It revealed that the promise had never required either person to remain within the mansion. Instead, it required them to leave it together before sunrise and return with an answer chosen freely. The young woman looked toward the narrow window above the chamber. The sky had begun to brighten. Dawn was approaching. She closed the book and took a slow breath. Then we have very little time. The Vampire King looked toward the hidden passage. We have enough. Together, they walked back toward the staircase, carrying the journal and the unopened mystery of what waited beyond the mansion. For the first time, neither of them felt trapped by the secret. They felt ready to choose their own future. The first light of dawn had begun to touch the windows when the young woman and the Vampire King returned to the main hall. The mansion no longer felt as mysterious as it had when she first arrived, yet it seemed to hold even more questions than before. She carried the ancient journal against her chest while he walked beside her, unusually quiet. Near the entrance stood an old grandfather clock, its hands moving steadily towards 6 in the morning. The young woman looked at it and remembered the message from the ancient book. They had to leave before sunrise and return with an answer chosen freely. "What happens if we do not return?" she asked. The vampire king looked toward the open doorway. Beyond it, the grounds were slowly becoming visible beneath the pale morning sky. "Then the promise ends with us." She considered those words carefully. For generations, everyone who had lived within these walls had believed that the mansion required them to remain connected to its secrets. Now she understood that the opposite might be true. Perhaps the promise existed only to guide someone toward freedom. They stepped outside together. The morning air was cool and fresh, and the familiar world beyond the mansion looked strangely peaceful. For the first time since her arrival, she could hear ordinary sounds in the distance. Birds were beginning to call from the trees, and somewhere beyond the property, a car passed along the quiet road. The vampire king stopped near the stone path. "There is something I have never told you," he said. She turned toward him. "What is it?" He looked back at the mansion. "I have spent years believing that protecting this place was my purpose. I thought I had to preserve every secret because that was what my family expected of me. But tonight made me realize that a promise can become a burden when no one remembers why it was made." She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we should remember why it was made." He nodded. Together, they walked toward the edge of the grounds. At the old iron gate, she opened the journal one more time. The pages were blank. Then new words appeared beneath the final message. "Trust is not inherited. It is chosen." She read the sentence aloud. The vampire king looked at her with quiet understanding. "That is the answer," he said. She closed the journal. "No, it is the beginning of the answer." They left the mansion behind and followed the road toward the town. Neither knew exactly what waited ahead, but neither felt the need to turn back. Several miles later, they stopped at a small roadside cafe, just as the first sunlight reached the rooftops. They sat near the window with 2 cups of coffee, speaking quietly about everything they had discovered. For the first time, they were not keeper and visitor, nor guardian and stranger. They were simply 2 people deciding what came next. Back at the mansion, the ancient book remained open on the stone table. A final line appeared across its empty page. The story continues wherever they choose to take it. The morning had fully arrived by the time the young woman and the vampire king finished their coffee. Outside the small cafe, the town was beginning to wake, with shopkeepers opening doors and families starting their daily routines. Everything looked ordinary, almost peaceful, yet both of them knew that the night had changed their lives forever. The young woman placed the ancient journal on the table between them. "We cannot leave the mystery unfinished," she said. The vampire king nodded. "Then we need to understand what the first keepers were protecting." She opened the journal, expecting to find the same mysterious pages they had seen inside the mansion. Instead, a new passage appeared. It described an old property several miles beyond the town, a quiet farmhouse that had once belonged to the human family connected to the promise. According to the journal, the farmhouse contained the final piece of the story. The young woman looked toward the window. "Do you know where it is?" "I have heard of it," he replied. "My family was told never to visit." She smiled gently. "Then perhaps that is exactly where we should go." They left the cafe and continued down the road. The journey took less than an hour, and soon the town disappeared behind them. Open fields stretched toward the horizon, covered in morning light. Eventually, they reached a narrow country lane surrounded by tall trees. At the end stood an old farmhouse with white wooden walls and a wide front porch. It looked simple, welcoming, and completely different from the mansion. The young woman stepped onto the porch and noticed a small wooden box beside the front door. Inside was another key and a handwritten note. She unfolded it carefully. The message contained only one sentence. The truth was never meant to belong to one side. She looked at the vampire king. "That sounds familiar." He gave a quiet smile. "The promise keeps saying the same thing in different ways." The key opened the farmhouse door. Inside, sunlight filled a modest room with old furniture, family photographs, and shelves of books. Unlike the mansion, there was no feeling of secrecy here. It felt like a home that had been waiting patiently for someone to return. On the wall hung a large framed photograph showing two families standing together many years earlier. The young woman moved closer. Among the people in the photograph was a woman who looked remarkably like her. She touched the frame gently. That cannot be possible. The Vampire King studied the photograph. Perhaps it is not impossible. Perhaps your family knew more than you were ever told. Beneath the photograph, they discovered a wooden cabinet containing dozens of letters. The first letter explained that the original promise had been created not to hide the truth forever, but to protect it until a future generation was ready to understand it. The final letter carried a date from decades earlier and ended with a simple message: when they finally meet, let them decide together. The young woman looked at the Vampire King, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she understood. Their meeting had not been an accident, but neither had it been a command. The choice had always remained theirs. She closed the letter and smiled. Now I think I understand what the promise was asking from us. He looked toward the open doorway, where sunlight stretched across the porch. And what is that? She answered softly. To stop carrying the past as a burden and start carrying it as a lesson. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour, and for the first time, the future seemed wider than the secrets they had spent the night uncovering. The afternoon sun had begun to soften when the young woman and the Vampire King finished reading the final letters inside the farmhouse. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt peaceful now, as if the house itself had finally released a secret it had carried for generations. The young woman carefully returned the letters to the wooden cabinet and looked again at the old photograph. If our families knew about this promise, why did no one tell us? She asked. The Vampire King considered the question before answering. Perhaps they were afraid that the past would shape our choices before we had the chance to make them ourselves. She nodded slowly. That explanation made more sense than any hidden prophecy. The ancient promise had never truly been about predicting their future. It had been about giving them the freedom to choose it. She opened the journal one final time. The pages were blank again, but this time she was not surprised. I think it is waiting for us, she said. Waiting for what? He asked. She picked up a pen from the desk. For us to decide what the next chapter should say. She wrote a single sentence across the first empty page. We choose our own path. The ink settled into the paper, and nothing mysterious happened. No hidden door opened. No new message appeared. The simplicity of the moment made her smile. For the first time, the journal was not controlling the story. It was simply recording it. The Vampire King watched quietly, then reached for the photograph. He studied the faces of the two families and noticed something neither of them had seen before. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten date and a short note. He read it aloud. One day, the descendants will meet again, not as keepers and strangers, but as equals. The young woman looked at him. Then perhaps we have already fulfilled the promise. Perhaps, he said, but I think we have also changed what it means. They stepped outside onto the porch. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of grass and distant rain. Behind them, the farmhouse stood quietly beneath the open sky. They could have returned to the mansion and continued guarding its secrets, but neither felt that was necessary anymore. Instead, they decided to preserve the journals and letters in a safe place where future generations could read them without fear or obligation. The Vampire King would no longer live only for the expectations of his family, and the young woman would no longer wonder whether her life had been shaped by a destiny she had never chosen. They would remember the mansion, the hidden library, the ancient book, and the mysterious promise, but they would carry those memories as lessons rather than chains. As evening approached, they began the journey back toward town. The road ahead was unfamiliar, yet it no longer seemed uncertain. The young woman looked at the fading sunlight and smiled. Do you think the mansion will change now? The Vampire King looked toward the distant horizon. I think it already has. Behind them, far beyond the fields, the old mansion stood beneath the evening sky. One window briefly reflected the last light of day, then became quiet again. The ancient story had reached its final page, but their lives had only begun to write something new.